Yo. Let's read shit, bitch. Bitch. This is the type of shit that'll get you banned. Reading books. Alright. Inadequacy of methods. In the face of total propaganda, it is clear that tests are useless. The reality can never be duplicated. You cannot stop a man in the heat of a meeting to ask him what he thinks. You cannot measure with any precision the effects of a film because you cannot disassociate it from current newspaper articles and radio broadcasts on the same subject. Finally, in a country steeped in propaganda, you cannot take a key group of supporters and measure the effects on other groups of their bearing witness to the cause. Both groups already are shaped by earlier propaganda, and the difference between the two means nothing. Considering propaganda as it really is, in its totality, tests are impossible. In Le Dynamisme des Groupes, Rêve d'Action Populaire, I can't speak French. Baden stresses very convincingly the problem of psychic continuity. The use of experimental group assumes a historic group. Or the use of experimental groups assumes ahistoric groups, without a past and without content. From reactions of such groups, can one really draw conclusions that apply to real groups that have a past and are tied to the whole range of institutions in their society? So he's saying that we can't do research on how effective propaganda is because groups are, before you've tested the subject, it's already affected by propaganda. So there's no starting point or there's no null or what is it? There's no independent variable. That's the word. Learn reading comprehension with PMARS. Why should it be called that, Ivan? I think you're a piece of garbage, Ivan, and what is the point of your existence? I wonder. Do you have a point to your life or a purpose? What's wrong with you is what I'm saying. The problem itself defies definition. Also, the methods used to analyze the effects generally are inadequate. One method has been used frequently by American researchers, its object being to determine whether some propaganda instrument could change the opinions or prejudices of a group. Students were divided into 2 or 3 groups, with one of them designated a control group untouched by propaganda. The nature of their opinion on some specific question, such as that of race, was then established. Then the groups to be influenced were subjected to carefully prepared psychological manipulations via pamphlets, films, conferences, and so on. After the period of propaganda, an evaluation of opinion changes by ordinary methods was attempted, with the control group as a basis of comparison. The evaluation of opinion took place twice, once immediately after the manipulations, once after some time, in order to establish the persistence of the modifications. These experiments have been described by many American writers. Generally, the conclusion has been that such propaganda had very little effect, The patterns and stereotypes were little changed, and that group opinion remained unchanged. Moreover, the slim results that were obtained disappeared rapidly. I claim that such results mean nothing because the method is totally inadequate. Its shortcomings are numerous. First, the question under the experimentation is the experimenter's choice. It is not a burning, explosive question of immediate concern. I have demonstrated, however, that propaganda can only work in the face of profound immediacy. Second, such propaganda efforts always employ very modest means. Some pamphlets, 1 or 2 films, have no real propaganda efforts always employ modest means, have no real orchestration, and are short and inadequate and are of short and inadequate duration. Okay. Such propaganda efforts always employ very modest means, have no real orchestration, and are short and inadequate. And fuck me. One more time. Okay. Such propaganda efforts always employ very modest means, have no real orchestration, and are of short and I just don't like the way this is written, dude. That's why it's like not reading right in my brain. Such propaganda efforts always employ very modest means, have no real orchestration, and are of a short and inadequate duration. I think there should be an there. And are of short and inadequate duration. I don't know. Fucking this just reads weird to me. Fuck. Evidently, we cannot expect to eradicate a race prejudice after a few days or weeks of propaganda, no matter how well made. Moreover, such experiments take place in a vacuum, in that the individuals subjected to them are cut off from their normal milieu. The normal conditions under which propaganda works are in no way reproduced. Such propaganda takes place in no sociological context. Then, there is no crowd effect, no psychological tension, no interaction of individuals caught in a mass and exciting each other. The experiment is shared only by a few in a laboratory atmosphere. These conditions are the very opposite of propaganda. There is no participation in a general action, in a general line, in party activities. There is no tie to any organization. There is no call for action, nor any chance of engaging in any. But those are essential elements of propaganda. Finally, these laboratory experiments mean nothing because they do not reproduce the true milieu of real propaganda or its methods. They are at best attempts at partial influence, and it is completely useless to draw conclusions from them about the efficiency of real propaganda. To believe otherwise reveals considerable ignorance of the phenomena. Jacques Ellul is a fucking genius. I don't care what like anyone says. Did Smokey think like if I call him a faggot enough, P. Mars will stop reading him out of shame because people care? Like, does Smokey think people actually care what he thinks? Like, he tells Jamie Russell, "Don't go to Praise's channel." The next day, Jamie's at Praise's channel. Like, no one listens to you, Smokey, dude. Shut up. Fucking, you're just a fucking comedy act, bro. When I read Jacques Ellul, it speaks to my heart and my soul, and I identify with him. I see in him a kindred spirit. And it makes me feel, when I read his books, it makes me feel less lonely because it's like, oh, there's someone that understands. The James Gang. I'm in the James Gang too. James says the perfect law is freedom. On the other hand, attempts at analyzing public opinion have been made. Here, the researcher at least deals with real situations. A whole collection of devices have been used for such research, which, however, has been carried out in diffuse and fragmentary fashion. In this way, researchers in the United States have analyzed votes by groups, localities, classes, have systematically analyzed the mail received by a newspaper after a particularly significant article, have made surveys in theaters and movies houses in connection with propaganda films, particularly war films. In the last named instances, various expressions of approval and disapproval were scientifically collected. They have even tried to measure noises in theaters by using special equipment, noise meters, applause meters, but this turned out to be a failure because the spectators soon realized what was going on and modified their reactions. In principle, it is necessary that the analyst be completely hidden and neutral. Finally, certain words and the significance attributed to them before and after a propaganda campaign were analyzed. Of course, such analysis must be carried out in extremely diversified milieu and places. The use of key words is in fact very revealing with respect to unconscious absorption of propaganda. The James Gang. Ace Theo is such a weirdo. Free willers. He hates free will. Insane. In such surveys, the public must be aware of the research being done. However, when the method of participants is used, the subjects of the experiment know they are under observation. The participating observer must live in a given group, which should be localized and as unaware of him as possible, and he must be progressively assimilated into the group. He learns to know it inside and out, becomes integrated into it. His primary task is to observe daily events as an anthropologist observes primitive peoples, and these facts bearing on behavior allow the researcher to classify in successive effects of various forms of propaganda. Holy shit, that's what I've been doing. That's actually what I do. This will yield a complete pattern of individual attitudes and of changes in these attitudes within the social structure. This is probably the best and most precise method. From the limited results it produces, certain conclusions are warranted. But a major obstacle stands in the way. Trained teams of observers are needed, real social scientists, not partisans of propaganda. These people must be well paid for a long time for doing nothing. In reality, only the state can employ this method. So you think they're like people paid by the state to infiltrate these groups and observe and like analyze how effective propaganda is? Is that what like Twitwit's job was? Now like they're not paying her, so she left. And then this is exactly what I do too. Like I think human beings are not interesting at all to talk to, but I think their behavior is interesting. How easily manipulated they are, how like they're led like sheep off a cliff. I'm fascinated by people from I suppose, what do you say, anthropological or so, yeah. I'm like interested in people from like an anthropologist perspective, kind of. But like individuals themselves, like I think they're boring as fuck. Finally, there is a much easier and faster method, such as surveys by Roper or Gallup. This method can be employed frequently and yields reasonably sure, fast results. But it presumes genuine education on the part of the public. The public must not only understand the meaning of these services and lend itself to them, but it must also be without fear. For this reason, the usefulness of surveys to establish propaganda effects is limited. It cannot be used in a totalitarian system because the connection between the propaganda makers and the police is well known in such regimes, and because the public cannot respond properly to the questions asked. Similarly, surveys cannot gauge the effects of terror propaganda because the public will be intimidated. Finally, surveys cannot be used on minorities that feel oppressed, proletarians, Negroes, other racial or religious minorities. Nevertheless, surveys can evaluate what Franco Bourricard calls the elasticity of propaganda, which is a sure indication of its effectiveness. Vast propaganda sectors, therefore, cannot be measured with the help of surveys. Moreover, surveys give much better results in connection with instantaneous propaganda, i.e., during periods of intense propaganda, elections, or crisis. They reveal much less regarding sociological propaganda promulgating a myth, or in periods of calm. In fact, surveys must ask precise questions, offer limited choices, and refer to some localized common experience. Actually, I should type this out for Merle. I think Merle would appreciate this. It's interesting. Surveys are helpless in periods of calm and with regard to propaganda's broader aims. At best, they can discern certain tendencies or establish whether some word is more or less on the public's mind. But they cannot penetrate the myth whose hold on it the public does not recognize. There, psychoanalytic surveys would be needed, but such research can be conducted only on individuals. Even from another point of view, such opinion surveys, designed to reveal propaganda's influences, are very uncertain in their results. They rest on two presuppositions that I consider very debatable. The first is that propaganda's principal aim is to modify public opinion, to replace some current of opinion, to manipulate individual opinions. But that certainly is not accurate. There can be profound propaganda effects that do not manifest themselves outwardly by changes of public opinion on one subject or another. The second presupposition is that surveys reveal the composition of public opinion, and that such composition is the only thing that counts. But in reality, another equally important element needs to be studied: the intensity of opinion. That intensity cannot be established by opinion analysis, despite all weighted indices. The multiplicity of questions, the cross questions, and so on. It must be remembered that two groups of the same size in a society may be entirely different with regard to intensity of their opinions and the degree of their integration in society. For example, in 1948, to say that there were 25% communists and 25% anti-communists in France, to take the simplest possible example, means nothing. For on one side, there are militants who are ready to throw themselves headlong into action and to sacrifice themselves, and what is even more important, are well organized, whereas on the other, there are unorganized people who have no intention of emerging from their passive individual state. And it must be understood that propaganda operates increasingly on the qualitative level in the domain of intensities. Any propaganda that had not changed a single vote, but had pushed a revolutionary group to white heat or diminished the conviction and devotion of another group, would have success without an opinion analysis being able to register it. Conversely, such analysis might register opinion changes, for example, among the undecided, which appear in the wake of a one-shot propaganda, but which ultimately surprise the propagandists by failing to last. That's really interesting. So, the intensity of your beliefs or the intensity of your opinion can be altered by propaganda. So maybe it doesn't have to necessarily change your opinion, but it make you believe really strong in your opinion to make you take action, or it could sort of pacify you, make you docile, make you inactive, because make you not care as much. And thus, without changing your opinion or your belief, it's affected you and affected the society at large. Finally, I must raise a last question. Opinion surveys concern themselves with public opinion and must address themselves to the entire group whose opinion is to be analyzed. For this reason, surveys operate with representative samples, yet an aggressive propaganda will not necessarily address itself to all of public opinion. It will take into its sights only a particular subgroup, fraction, or tendency. Because propaganda has precise objectives, it does not concern just anybody. To analyze whether such selective propaganda is effective, it would be necessary to analyze only the target group or the particular tendency that was to be modified. But generally, it will not be known which sector will be attacked by the propagandist, and when it is known, it will be too late. For all these reasons, public opinion survey methods are not really adequate to measure the effectiveness of propaganda. Analysis of individual cases are being made concerning individuals who have been subjected to propaganda. In the wake of World War II, American and British psychologists and sociologists undertook a large job. They made studies of German soldiers who surrendered in 1945 in an attempt to determine whether American propaganda aimed at persuading them to surrender had been effective. Schills and Janowitz, Dix, Gerfen, and Janowitz on German prisoners of war. Studies of German civilians in 1946 to determine whether they had been affected by Nazi propaganda. Padover. Studies of captured elite troops in the United States and Canada in 1945. Hicks. Studies of refugees from the USSR to determine the effects of Soviet propaganda. Inkeles. A series of investigations in the American Army, undertaken in 1942-3, to determine whether American soldiers were conscious of war aims, must be included in these research projects. Most of these investigations had negative results, i.e., they showed that propaganda had no decisive effect. But I feel that all these studies suffered from inadequate methods. First of all, concerning Germans integrated by British and Americans, what credibility can be accorded to statements by men who are prisoners, vanquished, accused, who have gone through tremendous ordeals, and who are in the presence of their masters, their victors, their eventual judges? To think that these men spoke the truth simply because they were promised anonymity or impunity is childish. Precisely because they have lived under Nazism, and even more because they had accepted it, they could not give the least credence to such guarantees. The Nazi regime had used the same stratagems to uncover and eliminate its enemies. These prisoners necessarily lived in a universe of combat, of lies, of commitment, whereas the researchers placed themselves and wanted to place the prisoners in a liberal, unconstrained, frank universe. This misunderstanding vitiated all the findings of these investigations. Without being paradoxical, one might even say the more these investigations showed that the prisoners had not been affected by propaganda, the more they really proved that the men were still living the lives of propagandees. On the other hand, how can one believe in the sincerity of responses concerning a man's Nazi convictions in Germany after 1945, when Nazism had been outlawed and Nazis were being eliminated from German administration? With regard to prisoners, how can one fail to see that for a prisoner of war of 1 or 2 years, no longer subjected to propaganda, his position vitiates all conclusions one can possibly draw from such inquiries? Some of these authors are aware of the shortcomings of this method. For example, Guffin says that German prisoners were not familiar with the methods of surveys, were inhibited by their long subjugation in Germany, and so on. Nevertheless, these authors still use the methods and draw conclusions from their findings. As you do. Because only 15% express Nazi convictions, 10% express feelings favorable to Nazism, 50% are indifferent, and 25% are hostile. To assume that a mass of individuals subjected for 10 years to Hitler's propaganda retained their critical capacity vis-a-vis the regime is to draw conclusions that are entirely uncertain, despite this enormous labor undertaken. The most serious fault of all these investigations seems to be the following. They preserve the old notion that the effect of propaganda manifests itself in clear, conscious opinions, and that the propagandee will respond in a specific way according to the propagandist's slogans. But this is less and less true. One must understand that just as there is dissociation between private and public opinion, there is disassociation between opinion and action. Propaganda works in that direction. It has not because some individual holds clearly defined Nazi or communist convictions that he will behave for the benefit of the Nazi or communist regime. On the contrary, it is increasingly understood that those who have clear, conscious convictions are potential heretics who discuss action in the light of doctrine. Conversely, because a man cannot clearly express his war aims does not mean he will comport himself less well on the battlefield if he is properly indoctrinated with propaganda, or fail to exterminate Jews just because he is not an articulate racist, or fail to be a devoted militant because he cannot formulate the dogma of the class struggle. What matters to the propagandist is to have a good soldier, a devoted militant, pogromist. Thus, to declare that 50% of German prisoners of war were indifferent to Nazism because of their negative response to trick questions is to bypass the problem. What is important is to know what they did. Did they participate in Jew hunts and the destruction of ghettos, in the executions of civilians, bombardments of cities, torpedoing of hospital ships, and so on? If they did these things, they did so because they had a motivation far stronger than their opinions, one that will not be revealed by a questionnaire of this sort. A good example of such opposites. Oh, what is he talking? Oh, like people believing one thing and doing the other. Good example of such opposites is the following. In connection with the trial of a Jewish defendant, Bariki, many judiciary chroniclers wrote anti-Semitic reports, as revealed by Miss Hess in Evidences 1959. But none of these writers was a racist. On the contrary, they were anti-Nazis, and they strongly protested their friendship for the Jews. Still, their reports were what they were. While writing them and trying to explain the actions of the defendant by his origins, the writers actually adhered to the stereotypes, images, and prejudices of anti-Semitic propaganda, which had remained fully unconscious, but still determined their actions, though on the conscious level they were absolutely not anti-Semites. And when they became aware of what they had done, they insisted they had never meant to say that. With the trial of a Jewish defendant, many judiciary chronicles wrote anti-Semitic reports. That's weird. Similarly, to conclude that propaganda had little effect on the German soldiers and left them on a private, individualized level merely because they were much more interested in the fate of their families than in anything else seems to me to have little relation to reality. When the average militant is captured, is out of action, and protected against propaganda, he will obviously return to his personal problems. This does not mean that he was not under the influence of propaganda when he was plunged into action. On the contrary, as I have shown, the cessation of propaganda leads the propagandee into privatization. With regard to the inquiries of American soldiers, they suffered from the same faults. To conclude that there is a contrast between war propaganda and individual opinion because less than 20% can name the officially promulgated war aims, less than 10% know the basic points of the Atlantic Charter, and more than 50% define their war aims in purely personal terms, is to think very negligently. For the aim of propaganda obviously was to obtain the most courageous and efficient soldiers, and not necessarily those inspired by a moral ideal. Propaganda played on the most elementary drives to make a man engage wholeheartedly in combat, in that it was effective, even if it could not express itself in ideological war aims, or it restricted itself to the formulation and dissemination of war aims. Then it was a childish form of propaganda that could not move anybody, and one must not be surprised if individuals formulated their own war aims differently. Moreover, attention must also be paid to the effect and depth that occurs when these war aims, liberty, war against barbarism, etc., are absorbed. This effect can be very active, but will not necessarily be expressed by the propagandee in the same terms as by the newspapers. Differences between propagandist formulas and their repetition by the propagandee do not mean that he fails to act. It must be concluded that this entire research method cannot measure propaganda effectiveness. Finally, word on efforts to measure tangible effects, shifting of votes, increased sales in the wake of an advertising campaign, joining a party as a result of a membership drive, this is all very limited. Political parties always make such efforts to evaluate their actions. They try to interpret all indications and to accord propaganda the part that it played. A very good example of this form of analysis has been furnished by Sergei Chakchin after studying the 1932 election results in Germany. In that study, the effects of the social democratic propaganda in Hesse emerged very clearly. Then, there are the research studies by American political parties to explain the 1952 elections, and particularly the shift of Catholic votes away from the Democrats. This was apparently the result of a variety of propaganda efforts, propaganda on un-American activities, nationalistic propaganda, military and even religious propaganda, hopes of seeing an American Pope. Eisenhower tied the struggle against communism to religious nationalism. Religion is the counterweight to tyranny. This apparently greatly influenced Catholics. Finally, the Communist Party, after having made propaganda in some district or village, evaluates the results by the number of petitions, collections, signatures, and so on. But no real significance can be attributed to such research operations. The criticism of Chakchin's analysis is well known, as is the attribution of entirely other causes than social democratic propaganda to the election defeat in Hesse. Nothing certain emerges from such analysis. Other attempts at measuring effects are being tried by commercial firms in regard to advertising. The object is different, but the methods are related. Commercial firms are interested in immediate results in order to learn whether it is advantageous to advertise, whether advertising produces side benefits when they should advertise, before and after launching a new product, at what time of the year, how far to go, how not to overshoot the mark. At best, all this can emerge only from analysis of past effects. But we must also ask who is reached by advertising. There are thousands of ways of looking at this: loss leaders, free samples, questionnaires, and so on. But they all disregard the influence on the unconscious, the most important part. This education of reflexes and instilling of habits is propaganda's true effect, and cannot be gauged by direct inquiry, but only by the massive participation it evokes. What counts is to assess the total effect of advertising. In the commercial world, it will be measured in money. The cost of advertising is compared with returns. Generally, advertising costs are between 5% and 20% on the sales price. If they exceed 20%, one may doubt the returns justify the added expense. But there are exceptions when such costly campaigns are accompanied by a great improvement in the quality of the product. For example, advertising doubled the sales of the French cigarette Gitantes in 1 year. The problem of return is central in commercial affairs. The state does not always have to count propaganda costs and limit them. It is easy to see the disproportion between the enormous sums expended by and the returns in the cases of Nazi Germany and the USSR, and also the Americans during the war. In fact, the aim frequently exceeds simple questions of money. If the object is to gain 10% more votes in order to marshal unanimity behind some economic program, stimulate energies, eliminate an opponent's psychological resistance, influence foreign public opinion, all this can be well measured, and the importance of the DeMark is such that money is spent without being counted. In other situations, the state frequently cannot even try to measure the propaganda returns. For example, in wartime propaganda directed to an enemy cannot be measured by its repercussions, feedback. In any event, if the psychological shock succeeds, it must remain hidden, for otherwise the propagandees would immediately be arrested by their own police, and all propaganda effect would stop. Besides, if a government knows that some foreign propaganda is effective, it will make appropriate counter-propaganda. To sum up this analysis of the inadequacy of the various methods designed to evaluate the effectiveness of propaganda, let us add the following observations. 1. Most sociologists and politicians consider the mathematical method the most exact and efficient, but this method seems to me not just debatable, but wrong. The mathematical methods, statistics, etc., can be applied only within very narrow limits, and to problems that generally have had to be taken out of context. Most sociological phenomena defy this method. The desire to reduce a situation to precise figures presumes a threefold prior operation. A. The removal of the fact to be quantified from its psychological, religious, sentimental, historic context, and its removal from the individual's Weltanschauung as a whole. The reduction of the phenomena. B. The reduction of the phenomenon to its simplest state by elimination of all complexities and subsidiary aspects, which may actually be the most important. C. Consideration of the external phenomena only, though there may be merely consideration of the external phenomena only, though they may be merely extensions of a more important, different factors. But quantification must restrict itself to external aspects, behavior, visible attitudes, and so on. This would be barely acceptable if it were admitted that the results are rather thin and relatively insignificant, but because they are expressed in figures, and because we have a maniacal faith in the exactness of mathematics, it is claimed that such methods produce the truth itself, and that the rest is literature. But it is precisely the rest that is most important, so long as we do not have a total robot image of man. It is the rest that is important. It is the rest that is important, so long as we do not discount man altogether, as do the Kinsey Report and others. What is particularly serious in this connection is that the psychologists who use such mathematical methods are quick to claim that what cannot be reached by their methods does not exist. But I have tried to show that such methods are inadequate for the problem studied here, and I must add that the results attained and the figures arrived at never go beyond what is already obvious and merely common sense. To prove with figures, after long statistical inquiries, that women are more receptive to emotional propaganda than men is hardly an astounding revelation. Common sense also tells us that man has a certain psychic ability that cannot be altered radically by propaganda. Figures, charts, and ratios add little to that. What's up, Universal Artisan? Okay, 2. My second observation is that these so-called scientific methods are extremely partial. All analysis of effectiveness with regard to propaganda that I have seen reveal an unconscious bias. To give just one example, most American studies on the relative effectiveness of Nazi and American propaganda conclude that Nazi propaganda did not have a profound effect on the Germans, that Nazi propaganda in no way whatever reached American opinion, but that American propaganda had certain tactical effects on German soldiers, inducing them to surrender in 1945. But Goebbels also had some rather thorough, systematic studies made that invalidate the first two claims. With regard to the third, even the American specialists themselves are in disagreement. Schills, and Warburg. The psychologists and sociologists who have held that propaganda had little effect all share certain views based on the choice of values. They are humanists who believe in the resolute character of human nature, the permanence of personality, the irrational but stable foundations of psychic life, and who, unconsciously, refuse to admit that men can be entirely mastered, dominated, conditioned. Or they are convinced Democrats who believe in the democratic presupposition that the citizen must be able to retain autonomy of will and judgment, because without it, elections would mean nothing, elected representatives would represent nothing, and there could be no longer, and there no longer, and there could be no longer, God, I can't read, and there could no longer be talk of the sovereignty of the people. It is completely acceptable to have such a view of man, but it is a metaphysical view. It is perfectly acceptable that a man should remain an optimist and an idealist, and for that reason declare that propaganda is not very formidable, and make it an act of faith that man will always come out on top. But people should not claim to have reached such conclusions by scientific analysis, statistics, and sociological experiments. Let us remember the American socio-psychologists are not unanimous in their estimates of effectiveness. In general, one can see the full success of all forms of propaganda and of justification. The individual always firmly believes in whatever justifies him. I would also like to suggest a relatively simple experiment: study Lenin's propaganda principles and apply them to the actions of the Soviet leaders. The results that they seek by propaganda almost always emerge very clearly and are generally obtained. Okay. 3. Propaganda's effectiveness, or the absence thereof, cannot be established by such methods. It can be done only by observation of general phenomena, by the best possible use of our general knowledge of man and his socio-political environment, by a mixture of judgments of approximation, and by the best possible use of the clearest of reasons. This cannot lead to figures or to strict certainties, but it yields certain probabilities, and above all, precludes the massive errors into which the exact methods lead us. Fascinating. Dude, this guy is a genius. If I wasn't me, I wish I was Jacques Ellul. I'm out.